Hey everybody, it's Lisa Harner. We're at the courtroom at ESC. We're getting ready for our first lunch and learn. So just welcome everyone. You have in the lower right-hand corner a place where you can add comments so you can ask questions of our presenter today. Also, if you're having any issues being able to hear, we know that everything is very sensitive here in this location. And so if you can't hear because of the sound we're making, just send a little comment in and we'll try to make sure we adjust our sound. Let's see. Today will be recorded, so if you are having technical difficulty but you want to catch it later, you'll be able to see that because it'll be recorded. And I think we're getting ready to start. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. Erin Crawford comes to us from Children's Center. She is the Community Outreach Coordinator. She has spoke with our staff on a couple of occasions about child abuse and neglect and also sexual abuse. So we are happy today to be talking with everyone about ACEs and trauma. And so we just want to welcome Erin and tell us a little about yourself and then we can get started. Okay?
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you to everybody for having me back again. Like she said, I got to visit with probably all of you or most of you here at the ALSAC meeting, and then I was back at the North Dublin Head Start to do a little makeup training, so that was a fun day as well. So thanks for having me. Like she said, I work for the Children's Center of Southwest Missouri. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking to you guys about who we are and what we do over at the Children's Center, just kind of explain why I'm the one here talking to you all about ACEs today. I am the Community Outreach Coordinator there at the center, so I always say I have the most fun job of anybody. I get to run around and visit with groups of people like you who are working with kids and interested in keeping kids safe, so that is always a pleasure for me. We are talking about ACEs today, adverse childhood experiences. We're going to talk about what that means, kind of how we know about ACEs, and what it means for kids, what kind of impacts kids are going to experience after they have experienced some kind of trauma. Let's see if my clicker is going to work, and it is. So first of all, like I said, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the Children's Center. I know most of you have heard this already, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. The Children's Center is a child advocacy center, and that means that we assist in the investigation of child abuse and neglect. So when there are investigations going on with the Children's Division, with our law enforcement, with our juvenile office, we work with all of those folks to make sure that those investigations are conducted in a child-centered way, and that whatever is in the best interest of those kids is what's going on during those investigations. We cover 12 counties here in Southwest Missouri. We have 4 locations. Our Joplin location is just right down the road up here at 7th and School, right across from Sears Plaza, right in the middle of all of that lovely construction that's going on at the moment. We also have offices in Monette, Nevada, and Butler. So I want to tell you really quick about the services we offer, kind of what we're doing over there on a regular basis. The first thing I want to tell you about is kind of our bread and butter service, the service that we have kids coming in and out every day for, and those are our forensic interviews. Prior to the availability of a child advocacy center like the Children's Center, kids were often interviewed multiple times by multiple professionals. During abuse investigations, they could be interviewed by teachers and principals and people at school. They could be interviewed by Children's Division, law enforcement, juvenile office, prosecuting attorneys, other attorneys, judges, doctors, nurses, social workers at the hospital. All kinds of people might have been interviewing kids over and over again. So kind of our answer to that is to bring all those folks onto the same page, into the same place, and interview that kid one time. We have staff who are trained to conduct those interviews, to make sure that they're developmentally appropriate and that they're non-leading. And all those folks who are conducting investigations can watch on while we do that, so they can benefit from the information without having to question that kid over and over again. So we do conduct those interviews. The medical exams is another service that we offer. We are really lucky here in Southwest Missouri. In a lot of parts of the state, children have to be referred to Children's Mercy or to another hospital to have a medical exam done during an abuse investigation, but we actually have a full-time nurse practitioner right here in town at the Children's Center. So any child who comes for a forensic interview can also see Susan, the nurse practitioner, and we have a few other contracted providers in our outlying centers as well. During those medical exams, first of all, we want to make sure kids are safe. We want to make sure they're healthy. We want to make sure they haven't missed out on any medical treatment that they need to have. But then next, we want to collect evidence. We photograph injuries. We can complete rape kits and collect fluids and fibers if we need to, if there's been a sexual assault that's recent. And then we make all of that evidence available to our law enforcement partners. So that's our medical program. We also have a therapy program. I consulted with our therapy department a little bit on this training that I'm going to share with you guys today because their specialty is trauma. They offer trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. They are all registered play therapists. They are all newly trained in EMDR, which is a specialized type of trauma therapy as well. So we want any child who has experienced abuse or neglect to come back and work with those therapists to kind of mitigate the effects of ACEs, which is what we're going to talk about today. We do some behind the scenes work with case tracking and advocacy. We just want to make sure that everybody is on the right track and that everybody's on the same page and doing their jobs so that these kids have the best outcomes that they possibly can. And then community outreach. That's me. I'm the one-person community outreach department at the Children's Center, so I get to run around and train and do the best that I can to make sure that as many adults as possible understand the dynamics of abuse and how we can detect it and prevent it. So let's get started talking about ACEs. I need to stay kind of like right here. Right, Jess? I need to like stay right here. All right. You guys are going to see me doing this a lot because I'm used to walking, but I can stay here. Give me a signal if I'm walking too far out of my zone here. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the original ACEs study. There have been lots of studies that have replicated the ACEs study since then. So you'll see some different numbers in some places, but it's just because the study's been repeated over and over again. The original ACEs study took place in the mid-90s, but it has its roots all the way back in the mid-80s. So in 1985, a guy named Dr. Vincent Felitti, who was with Kaiser Permanente, that's a big healthcare conglomerate out in California, he was conducting a study of obesity. So he had all of these clients and he was testing out this special way that he had come up with to lose weight. What he found was that tons of people were dropping out of that study. Even people who were successfully losing weight were dropping out in really high numbers. So he started talking to those people. He brought them back in and did interviews with them. And what he found was that a lot of them, the majority of them, were reporting childhood trauma. Were reporting that they had been abused, especially sexually abused, when they were young. So he took a couple of conclusions from this. He thought, hey, maybe this childhood abuse, maybe this childhood trauma has something to do with the obesity in the first place. Maybe that's part of the reason, maybe a coping mechanism for this abuse and trauma caused the obesity. And also, maybe these folks are dropping out of my study, are dropping out of what looks like a successful weight loss program because of this trauma as well. The folks who were staying in the program were less likely to report child abuse. So he was really curious about that link between childhood trauma and health. So what he did is he contacted the CDC. Dr. Anda there worked with him, and they conducted a really large study. They surveyed about 17,000 people who were clients at Kaiser Permanente. That's like I said, a really big conglomerate of healthcare out in California. They surveyed all these people, and they looked at how their childhood experiences that were adverse, that's what they call them, any kind of traumatic experiences, impacted their health. And let's take a look at what they measured and then what they found. So there are 10 ACEs. There are 10 identified adverse childhood experiences that they looked at during this original study. Most of the studies that have been replicated since then use really similar experiences, if not the exact same. So there are 5 different ACEs. They're kind of divided into 2 groups. The first group is abuse and neglect type adverse experiences, and the other ones are what we call dysfunctional household or household issues. So there are 3 types of abuse that they looked at: physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. In addition to that, they looked at physical abuse and physical neglect and emotional neglect. So we have our 3 types of abuse, our 2 types of neglect, and then the 5 household dysfunction issues. Mental health in the household, someone being incarcerated, mom, dad, or somebody in the household having to go to jail or to prison as an adverse effect. This says mother treated violently. What we would generally say here is domestic violence taking place in the house, substance abuse occurring in the household, and then divorce or separation of parents as the 10th adverse childhood experience that they looked at. So when we are surveying people, when we're looking at this, the scoring is really simple. However many of these experiences someone has had, that is their ACE score. If a child or an adult as a child experienced one of these things, then their ACE score is 1. If they experienced 7 of these things, then their ACE score is 7. So the lowest score you can have is 0. The highest score you can have is 10. So I like to talk first about how common that is. What did they find, and what have other people subsequently found in terms of how many people experience ACEs and how many different adverse childhood experiences people have experienced. So we do know that ACEs are pretty common. In most studies that come out regarding ACEs, whether that is a real large population like the original 17,000 that were surveyed, or sometimes we see little studies just in school districts of ACEs, about 2/3 of people report at least one adverse childhood experience. So we're only looking about 30%, 33% of people who have that ACE score of 0. The rest are going to report at least one ACE. They tend to occur in groups, and I think that this makes sense. We know that the majority, from 65% to 87%, depending on which study you look at, that percentage of people who report one ACE report more than one. So the majority of people who have ever experienced any adverse kind of trauma as a child have experienced more than one. And I think that makes sense when we look at them, because we know that a lot of these are going to occur together, right? When we look at, let's say, sexual abuse, it's impossible to sexually abuse a child without also emotionally abusing that child. Physical abuse and emotional neglect and even physical neglect often go hand in hand. We see those events occurring together. And then when you look at these household issues, those are more likely to occur along with abuse and neglect as well. Domestic violence and physical abuse of children are really likely to go hand in hand. So it's really likely that if someone has experienced one ACE, they've experienced more than one. They have a cumulative effect. So what we know, so what impacts do ACEs have? What does that mean for kids? What does it mean for us as professionals who work with kids? The more ACEs, the more adverse childhood experiences someone has experienced, the more of an impact they're going to see. The more detrimental health impacts, the more detrimental mental health impacts, social, behavioral issues. The more ACEs a person has, the more trouble they're going to have with those sorts of things. So you can see that kind of risk factor going up. Now, there are lots and lots of issues, myriad issues that have been scientifically linked to ACEs. Usually we put them in kind of 2 broad categories. The first one are kind of social issues, behavioral issues, and high-risk behaviors. Stuff like smoking, alcoholism, drug use. They even, and I think this is kind of interesting, they look into issues like missed work days, trouble keeping employment, sedentary lifestyles. Those sorts of things are all associated with ACEs. We also look kind of on the other side at medical issues, things that on the surface don't seem to be linked to any kind of behavior. Stuff like heart disease and liver disease, cancer even, are linked to ACEs. Let's look at some, this is our kind of 2 pillars here. Our high-risk health behaviors that are kind of social in nature as well, and then our ill health, our medical issues, depression, heart disease, cancer. Doesn't it seem to you guys that cancer is unrelated to behavior and unrelated to experience? On the surface, it kind of feels like that. Doesn't it feel kind of random? But what these studies have found is that actually we can see a link between cancer diagnosis and traumatic experiences as children. So some numbers. I don't have numbers for each and every one of those issues because that would take all day. We don't want to do that. But we do know that compared to an ACE score of 0, so compared to someone who has no ACEs at all, having 4 or more of those childhood experiences, which isn't hard for most kids to get to, think of those kids that you work with. I was talking to an intern at the Children's Center today about what we thought was the average ACE score of kids that we see at the Children's Center. And we have kind of a specially selected group because they're there because of abuse and neglect. But our intern guessed 7. She said that if she had to bet, she would guess that the average ACE score of a child that we see at the center is probably around 6 or 7. I would say maybe in an income-based program like you guys run, maybe 3 or 4. Would you guys guess would be maybe an average ACE score? That's something to think about. And I think it's interesting to look at specific cases of kids you have and decide maybe what their ACE scores are. So comparing 0 ACE scores to 4, people have a 700 times more likely to experience alcoholism, 200% increase in cancer diagnosis, so twice as likely. If you have an ACE score of 4, you are twice as likely to be diagnosed with cancer, and 4 times more likely to have emphysema. Now, here's a really concerning and frankly very sad statistic at the bottom. An ACE score of 6 or above, so that's a lot, that's more than half of the ACEs, but the way they accumulate, it's not hard to find individuals who have experienced 6 or more ACEs. An ACE score of 6 or above is associated with a 3,000% increase in attempted suicide. So a lot of these issues are life-threatening. So, and we know, especially from that last one, that this is an issue of life and death to look at how trauma impacts kids. We know that trauma also has an impact on the way that brains develop. And I think that that is intertwined with especially a lot of those social, behavioral, mental health issues that kids with trauma experience. It's all intertwined with how their brains develop, how their brains respond to trauma and fear and toxic stress during the time when their brains are trying to grow and trying to develop. I have this very, very simple kind of representation of the brain to help me talk about this. We know that kids' brains, they develop from the bottom up. And so we start down here with the brainstem. Do you guys know Teresa Berry? Some people in here probably know Teresa. I know Teresa works with you guys. Now she is our clinical director for our therapy program at the Children's Center. She's wonderful. We love her. She spends a lot of time talking with kids about brain development, talking to them about their brains, how trauma impacts their brains, and kind of helps them to understand that cognitive triangle, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and how they interact. She calls the brainstem the lizard brain when she's talking to kids. It is that very most simple part of your brain that is only really concerned about safety and survival. It makes sure that you're breathing, makes sure that your heart's beating, but it also is a part of your brain where you respond to stress and to trauma. If there's fear involved, that's that little lizard brain back there responding. Have you heard of fight or flight? And we add freeze on there. That is the specialty of the lizard brain, the little brainstem down there. And then as time goes on and brains develop, we develop up into this limbic system. And that system is more responsible for emotions. A lot of behavior, we know that a lot of behavior is based on emotion, especially when you're little, right? And so it directs a lot of behavior because it is the center for emotions. And then as development continues, we get up to the cortex. That's where we have all of our conscious thoughts, where we're able to learn, where we're able to use reason. And so we know that that develops over time. But when that development is interrupted by trauma, when your brain's trying to grow and trying to change, and there's constant trauma interrupting that growth and development, it can be hard for those connections to be made. It can be hard for a child to step from that lizard brain safety focus up to emotional regulation, and then up to that place where we want them to be, where they're learning and they're thinking and they're using some reason to conduct themselves. Because I'm not a neurologist, but a social worker, this really made me think of Maslow's hierarchy. Are you guys familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Because the way that they list safety, emotion, and learning really reflects that, right? We know that if a child or any person has physiological or safety needs that are unmet, if we are feeling like we're in danger, if we feel like we are sleeping outside, or we don't know where our next meal is coming from, it's impossible to build up the pyramid to other needs that we have. Right? And the way that the brain develops kind of reflects that. If we are stuck in this safety brain, if we're stuck, Teresa always says, if you're stuck in your lizard brain, then you can't make good decisions, right? You can't make good decisions about behavior or whatever else you need to do. So we know that trauma can interrupt that. Here are some things that that can happen. And I think that a lot of these are really, really relevant for you all and when you're dealing with preschool age kids. My background is in early childhood, and so I know that you guys see these things a lot. When those connections can't be made, when that development from the brainstem to the limbic system to the cortex are interrupted, we see those physical brain changes like we've been talking about, lowers emotional control, because that connection with the limbic system may not be quite right, may not be structurally correct. That child may have a hard time with emotions. Who here has seen a preschool age kid who is not in control of their emotions? Lots of people? I've seen lots of them. I've seen teenagers who are not in control of their emotions. I've seen adults who are not in control of their emotions. And those things can be due to physical structures in the brain that just never had a chance to develop. Lowers learning ability. When those connections can't be made all the way up to that cortex, the driver's seat is the other analogy that Teresa uses. That cortex is the driver's seat of your brain. And if you're not sitting in the driver's seat, you're not going to be able to drive that car very well. And when we can't get there, learning is going to be very difficult. Behavioral control, I think that has everything to do with controlling emotions and understanding emotions. So we're also going to see those difficult behavior problems for kids who have experienced a lot of trauma and a lot of ACEs. I forgot to tell you guys, if you have questions, oh no, I don't need to be the only person talking in this courtroom. Okay, so let's talk about, this has a lot of stuff on it, so just ignore it for now, and it's just for me to help me explain it to you. So we've all known about ACEs for a long time. That study first came out in the 90s, like I said. People have been talking about it on and off since then. It's gotten to be really a prominent topic in the last couple of years. It's been talked about all over the place. It's very trendy, so to speak. And that is because it is very important. But what I'll tell you about myself and my work at the Children's Center is for a long time, it was hard for me to really integrate what we knew about ACEs into our work at the center. It's hard to sit down with a parent during a child abuse investigation and say, I really need you to understand how this adverse experience is going to make your child more likely to have heart disease or cancer. You know, it feels like a hopeless message sometimes. Sometimes it has a fatalistic feeling because your ACE score never decreases, right? Once you've experienced something, you can't unexperience it. So once you have an ACE score, you have an ACE score. And for a long time, I struggled. I knew, we have a lot of education that goes on at the Children's Center. I knew we needed ACEs to be a part of that because it's such an important thing to understand when you're talking about trauma. But I kept kind of running into this block of how do we talk with parents of abused kids about ACEs in a way that isn't totally discouraging and totally sad for them. And so as I came across these things, it made me feel better. It made me feel like maybe we can focus on positive experiences. Maybe we can focus on resiliency. I think you have my little infographic, and on the back side, it's way funner looking. My bubbles are back there, and they're more colorful. And they're all about ways that we can build up resiliency for kids to try to counter or mitigate the effects of ACEs. So there were actually 2 studies this year that were about ACEs, but they were actually about those experiences that may counter ACEs, those ways that we might be able to support kids in mitigating those impacts. So there were 2 studies. One was more of a student project at BYU that they did some write-ups on that was really interesting. Another was more formal, and it was published in the Child Abuse and Neglect Journal this year. So it gave us a lot of good information. And what they did is the first one at BYU called them counter ACEs, experiences that kids have during childhood that may be supportive, that may undo some of those bad outcomes that kids with ACEs have. So let's look at those. Let's look at the ones from BYU first. And I put little stars by the ones that I thought, these are especially important for Head Start people. So the first 3 are the ones: liking school, having teachers who care, and having opportunities to have fun. Those sound like 3 things that our Head Start program can do for kids with trauma, right? Those were the first 3 things listed as counter ACEs. Here are some other things that I think are also important for your programming because we're working with parents, right? We can encourage parents. Here are the things that I want to tell parents at the Children's Center. Hey, I know your child has experienced these things, and now their ACE score is 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever, but here are the counter ACEs. Here's what your child needs to be healthier, to be happier, and to make sure that those ACEs don't bring them down later. So a predictable home routine. That's pretty basic child development stuff, right? We know that kids need routine. They need to understand what's going to happen next. Feeling comfortable with yourself, having a caregiver whom you feel safe with, beliefs that provide comfort, and having good friends and neighbors, so having that community. Those are the items that they looked at and that they measured for people while they were also measuring their health outcomes. And they found something really interesting because their research question was, can these counter ACEs, can these positive experiences undo the effects of ACEs? And they found that they could. They found that there were more positive outcomes, that the effects of ACEs were mitigated by these counter ACEs, but also they found something else. They found that irregardless of ACE scores, even if your ACE score was 0, the absence of these counter ACEs produced some poor outcomes. So even if your ACE score was 0 and you had not experienced any of those 10 things, which we know is only about a third of people, even if you hadn't experienced any of them, if you lacked in a significant number of these counter ACEs, you were more likely to experience mental health issues, substance abuse issues, and other kind of negative outcomes as adults. So that was really interesting. Those counter ACEs were even more powerful than what they expected them to be. Later this year, this is all very recent. Later this year, there was another study that was published in the Journal of Child Abuse and Neglect. They were looking at kind of the same thing. They called them positive childhood experiences, or PCEs, instead of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And they looked at similar things. They identified these 7 issues that were positive for kids. Communicative family. The kind of long form that they put on the survey was being able to talk to your family during hard times or bad times. A supportive family, similarly was listed on the survey as a family who sticks by your side during hard times or bad times. Engaging in community traditions, a sense of belonging in school, supportive friends, and here's a big one, I think, for anybody in early childhood, 2 non-parent adults who were genuinely interested in you as a child, and protected by an adult in the home. They looked at these 7 items, and they, similarly to the BYU study, they kind of compared those experiences with health outcomes. Especially in this study, they were looking at mental health outcomes. And they found something similar. They found that irregardless of ACE score, having 6 to 7 PCEs, which means all of these or almost all of them, if you have experienced all these things or almost all of them, you are 72% less likely to experience what they call depression and poor mental health than if you only have 0 to 2 of them. So what that means is if you lack in these things, regardless of what your traumatic experiences are, if you lack in a large portion of these PCEs or positive childhood experiences, you're going to be much more likely to experience depression and to experience poor mental health. We know that these things do counter the effects of ACEs. That if we have, we get kids, especially at the Children's Center, because we have a specially selected group, it's not uncommon for us to see a kid who's 7 or 8 years old and their ACE score is 7 or 8. That's high. That's a lot. And it would be easy to start to feel really hopeless for that child. To go, well, this kid is 3,000 times more likely 3,000% more likely to attempt suicide. What do we do? This kid's still just a little bitty kid. But what I think this new wave of research is finally giving us are ways that we can counter it, tools that we can use to help kids. And I just, as I was putting this together, I just thought it was really significant and really cool that so many of them were reflective of exactly what you guys can do at Head Start. Liking school is the #1 counter ACE over there. Yes?
So I have a question because it pertains to what you're talking about.
Yes, please.
So I'm not in Head Start, and I have a few staff here that aren't.
Oh, gotcha.
We are working with the adult that as a child had it, and now we're, seeing, the effects of the childhood trauma on them.
Sure.
And I like all of these listed, and I think some of them might apply to an adult. But do they look at that, the list of things that they do to the adult now that, do they have a separate list? Or?
Like interventions. Yeah. So I don't have that right on hand. I think that a lot of these things can kind of
Some of them looked.
can go over, especially here, looking at, and the next slide is gonna kind of be like the culmination of the answer, and I think it can apply to adults.
I just didn't know if they specifically looked at adults as well.
Right. And I'm sure there have been studies that have. ACEs is one of the most studied items, and I'd love to look into that for you and send some stuff to you. But I do think a lot of these things can kind of transfer to adults. And I think another thing that's really healthy for adults to do, especially if you talk to them about ACEs, talk to them about these too, bringing these up and saying, hey, we know that your ACE score is 6, which, like I said before, I think can be discouraging, to say, well, I'm a 6, so, but to say, hey, I have another quiz for you. We are going to look at these positive childhood experiences and see how many of these things you experienced and talk about how that can counteract. I think that a little self-perception in there would be important for someone to understand, hey, I have these positive things. But I love how so many of these, for those of you who are working in Head Start, just really have such relevance for that early childhood setting. Like I said, that's somewhere that I've been a lot, and so it's important to me. Opportunities to have fun. Like, what a simple thing, and what a cool way that we can do something that's fun, but also feel like when we're doing that we might be counteracting the impacts of trauma. So this is kind of the crux of it all. Like I said, stable, nurturing relationships with caring adults can prevent or reverse the damaging effects of toxic stress. That has been kind of the keystone for resiliency for as long as people have been talking about resiliency in children, for as long as people have been talking about toxic stress, adverse experiences for children, and trauma, that those safe relationships with adults, those stable, predictable, reliable relationships with adults are the #1 indicator for resiliency and for positive outcomes. And those adults don't have to be parents. And like we looked at on our positive childhood experiences list, it's actually important to have non-parent relationships with adults, to have those stable relationships outside the household that kids can count on. So I think that not only from a child development standpoint, where we know that those safe, stable, communicative relationships are important for child development, from a trauma standpoint, they are very important as well. And they're the #1 thing that is going to counteract trauma and the effects of trauma for children who we're working with. I think that's my last slide. I don't know if I talked on it. Do you guys have any questions?
So an EMDR, is that not a good way, would that not be a way to lower the ACE score, since it's a way of putting like a bridge, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a perfect point. Yeah, I guess I should have said this right at the beginning. Any kind of mental health treatment is going to mitigate the effects of ACEs. That's our #1 kind of priority for kids who we know have experienced trauma at the Children's Center, is that they return and see our therapist. Any kind of trauma focused or trauma-based therapy program is going to be so important for anyone, child or adult, who has experienced trauma. So yeah, the EMDR certainly can mitigate those too. I know that for early childhood, it can be really difficult to get those referrals for mental health treatment. And I know that can definitely be a barrier. We see very small kids at the Children's Center. It's just that the way our funding works, we have to see kids when they've already gone through our forensic program for therapy. At this time, we can't open up that referral acceptance outside of our agency. It's something that we would like to be able to do at some point. I know those referrals can be hard for little kids. I think that there are 3 registered play therapists. I may be wrong, but my understanding is there are 3 registered play therapists in the area, and they all work for us. They're all on our staff. So it makes it kind of cool. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked me that. Anybody else have any questions?
Can you click one slide back? I was
Sure. Oh, wrong way.
jotting,
Yes.
a couple of those.
Please jot. I know that this has a lot of stuff on it. It's mostly just for me to be able to talk about it. Yeah, please do. Any other questions about ACEs or about child abuse?
Aaron, do you know, like,
in our local schools, since you've hit on schools several times,
Mhm.
do you know if schools are on track with this, if they understand how important teachers and how important schools can be?
I think they're getting there. I think that I know that there are school districts. I was reading up about Phoenix that quote on the next slide was from a big report that the city of Phoenix Children's Hospital there did, and I know that their school districts have picked that up and have implemented that. I think a lot of schools are starting to talk about ACEs, and they're starting to implement it. I'm really close with a group of school counselors in Joplin. I get to meet with them pretty regularly, and I know that they are talking about ACEs. I don't think that here in Joplin they're quite ready to execute a formal program to measure the ACE score of all the kids. Measuring ACE scores of kids is an interesting thing because they may change over time. And so it may not be worth all of the work to get that measurement in the 3rd grade, when by the 5th grade it might be completely different. Usually people are more likely to measure ACE scores of adults. But just taking that knowledge, like you said, and I have probably given you this impression, but I feel like this information is more important than the ACEs information. This information about what can counter trauma, because we looked at 2/3 of people experience at least one ACE. We know that about 20% of kids experience sexual abuse. One thing that I thought was and we know that from a different study from the Crimes Against Children Institute. In the original ACEs study, 21% of people reported child sexual abuse. So that just kind of builds more reliability for that statistic. So when you're working with a classroom full of kids, I think it's safe to forego the process of measuring every single child's ACE score and to just understand we're dealing with trauma in every classroom, and here are the things we're going to do to counter trauma, even if we don't know that about specific kids. Something I think the place that it really has its kind of shining moment in schools and even in programs like yours are in behavioral issues. When we're dealing with one specific kid who has outstanding behavioral issues, a child that's not gonna, that's disrupting everything. So now we're having meetings about him or her. The first thing that I think is important to ask is how many ACEs has this kid already experienced? If this kid is in early childhood, or if we're looking at a 1st grader, a 3rd grader, a 5th grader, what is their ACE score and how can we attach that behavior to that ACE score? We kind of talked about looking through a trauma lens at children and their behavior. Instead of, it's easy. Like I said, I've been in childcare. I know that it's easy to start to go, why does this child hate me? Why is this child trying to ruin my life or my day or whatever? But instead to look at that kid and go, what has happened here with this kid? What does this kid experience? What kind of emotions are they feeling? I think that's really important. I think that sometimes when kids are acting out, we just think that the emotion they're feeling is like anger and hatred sort of, but so much of the time, if you look at it, you might see this isn't anger, it's sadness or confusion or frustration or something else that may be related to an ACE. And so that's kind of looking through that trauma lens.
So you've touched on this, but I just want to give you an online question that
Yes.
came in. The question is, why does a child with a high ACEs treat the people in the school or the nurturing, safe environment so badly or so mean?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think that's something to bring out and look at. Sometimes we feel like kids hate us and they don't want our help, and they are being mean or treating us badly. And I think that it's really important to understand that from a child's perspective, they don't see it the way we see it. They don't see the perpetrators and the people causing the ACEs, and over here on the other side of the spectrum, the caring professional adults who are trying to help them. They just see all the grown-ups. And when they have their brain, you're done writing, I'm gonna go back to the brain. When you're always down here in the brainstem, you're not gonna be able to identify who's trying to help you and who's trying to hurt you. You're going to engage in that fight or flight. And it sounds like maybe we're talking about kids who are choosing that fight reflex, which is not at all uncommon. And you're going to be in that mode all the time, and it's going to be hard. And what happens is a cycle where, because kids are down here in this brainstem, because their safety needs are not being met, and that may be something ongoing and current. It may be something that happened before that has remained with them and prevents them from feeling safe even today. When they do that, they do lash out. They do choose that fight response, and then they are kind of distanced from those people that are trying to help them. Those people are going, this kid doesn't want me. this kid hates me, this kid doesn't want to engage. And then they get further and further from those positive experiences that could help them. So the important thing for us is to look past that mean, aggressive behavior and to go, why is this child acting like this? Can I, as a professional, accept this child and continue to try to help them even if they are acting out in this way or kind of resisting? If a child needs medicine and they resist it, we don't go, well, he knows best, he's not giving it. We go, this kid's getting this medicine one way or another. And so maybe when it comes to positive, stable relationships, if a child's resisting, we don't go, well, he knows best, he doesn't like me. We go, I'm going to be available for this stable relationship, no matter what, for this kid. Do you have a question?
I understand what you're saying here, and I think that's wonderful, but what about those things that happen daily that we, the children, have no control over, we have no control over, such as kids getting killed in school, and now children are having to think about that constantly. And I wonder if there's any kind of analysis about what the effect of that has been and whether or not, what it has done to them. And I just wasn't trying to.
Yeah, I think that fear can be very traumatic. Some studies on trauma look at, and I think this is really interesting, look at like community violence as a real marker, like as a specific type of trauma. Even if kids don't experience or witness it, kids who live, especially in like inner city communities where they know that there's gun violence and other types of violence going on around them, even if they don't see it, that can be a type of trauma because of the fear. I was at a school district in our 12 county service area, not in Jackson County, recently, and it was in the summer, right when school was getting ready to start. And I do during that time I do a lot of like in services with school districts, and I got in on the tail end of a safety talk. They were having their like school safety talk, and then I was going to talk after, so I heard the last bit of it. And the superintendent announced that they were going to have unannounced active shooter drills at the school. And I kind of regret that I didn't say anything. I was kind of reeling. I understand the value. I understand the approach of we want people to learn to react in real time. But the fear and the trauma that is going to cause, not only for the kids, but for the staff, is not worth that.
Yeah.
We just need to teach the kids what to do and hope that they do it if that comes up. But I was thinking about that. I was thinking that fear is going to cause trauma for those kids.
Right.
And I think that there are kids who, the more we see things in the news, the more things happen, that kids do, feel fear when they go to school. And I think that is absolutely trauma. I don't know of any specific research or study on that right now, but I'll tell y'all that it's forthcoming or out there and I don't know about it. One of those things. For sure. Don't do unannounced active shooter drills. Does that seem crazy to you guys too?
Yes.
That seems crazy to me. Any other questions? I don't know how long I talked or how long I was supposed to talk.
Perfect.
Am I good? Okay.
No questions, Jeff?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody. But yeah, well, thanks for having me, guys. Anytime, this is my full-time job, so if you come up with any other topic or anything that you guys want to know about in particular, let me know, and I can get some around for you. Yeah, thanks for having me. Grab some more pizza before you go. Or drink.
Do you want to announce we'll have another one next month?
Am I on?
Oh, don't forget to fill out
We're gonna have a lunch and learn next month.
Keep an eye out.
We'll send you an email. Thanks, everybody.
If you have evaluation data, do you mind forwarding that to me? Yeah. I just heard the same evaluation, so yeah.